Byron Donalds thought he was clever when he dismissed Jasmine Crockett as a diversity hire during the House Financial Services Committee hearing. What he didn't expect was for her to pull out his own voting record and systematically destroy every claim he'd ever made about representing Black Americans. The silence that followed his racist attack would become the most uncomfortable 12 minutes in congressional history. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the Rayburn House Office building as members of the House Financial Services Committee filed into hearing room 2128. It was October 17, 2024, and the committee was set to examine the Federal Reserve's latest monetary policy decisions and their impact on working families across America. The agenda seemed routine enough. Testimony from Fed officials, questions about interest rates, the usual partisan sparring over economic policy. Byron Donalds adjusted his navy blue tie as he took his seat on the Republican side of the dais. At 44 years old, the Florida congressman had built his reputation as one of the GOP's rising stars, frequently appearing on conservative media as a thoughtful voice on fiscal policy. As one of only 2 Black Republicans in Congress, Donalds carried the weight of representation that he both embraced and sometimes chafed against. His colleagues often looked to him to provide the party's perspective on issues affecting minority communities, a role that had elevated his profile, but also subjected him to intense scrutiny from both sides of the political aisle. 3 seats down on the Democratic side, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett was reviewing her prepared questions, occasionally making notes in the margins of her briefing documents. The 33-year-old Harvard Law graduate had quickly established herself as a formidable presence on the committee since arriving in Congress 2 years earlier. Her background as a civil rights attorney had served her well in navigating the complex intersection of financial policy and social justice, and she'd earned respect from colleagues for her thorough preparation and incisive questioning of witnesses. What neither Donalds nor anyone else in the room knew was that Crockett had spent the previous weekend doing something unusual, conducting an exhaustive analysis of her Republican colleagues' voting record. It wasn't personal animosity that had motivated this research, it was professional necessity. Crockett had noticed a pattern in recent committee hearings where Donalds would question the qualifications and motives of Democratic members, particularly women and members of color. She suspected that his own record might not withstand the same level of scrutiny he applied to others, and she wanted to be prepared if he decided to make her a target. Her instincts would prove prophetic. Committee Chairwoman Maxine Waters called the hearing to order at precisely 10 a.m., and the first hour proceeded as expected. Federal Reserve Vice Chair for Supervision Michael Barr testified about the central bank's approach to financial stability, fielding questions about bank regulation, cryptocurrency oversight, and the economic outlook. The exchanges were professional, if occasionally pointed, with Republicans generally pressing for less regulation and Democrats advocating for stronger consumer protections. But the atmosphere shifted dramatically when the hearing moved to its second panel, a discussion of community banking and access to financial services in underserved communities. It was a topic that should have been right in Crockett's wheelhouse, given her background in civil rights law and her district's significant minority population. As she began her 5-minute questioning period, she focused on how banking deserts affected economic mobility in communities of color. Mr. Harrison, she addressed the panel's lead witness, Community Banking Association President Robert Harrison. Your organization represents over 5,000 community banks across the country. Can you speak to the challenges these institutions face in serving low-income communities, particularly communities of color that have been historically underserved by the banking sector? It was a straightforward question, delivered in Crockett's characteristically measured tone. Harrison began a detailed response about regulatory burdens and capital requirements, but before he could finish, Byron Donalds interrupted with a point of personal privilege. "Madam Chairwoman, if I might," Donalds said, his voice carrying the smooth confidence that had made him a favorite on conservative talk shows. I think we need to be careful about the assumptions underlying the gentle lady's question. Chairwoman Waters looked puzzled. Points of personal privilege were typically reserved for urgent matters or procedural concerns, not for questioning a colleague's line of inquiry. The gentleman from Florida has 5 minutes for his point of personal privilege. Donalds leaned forward into his microphone, and what he said next would trigger one of the most explosive confrontations in congressional history. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I think it's important for the American people to understand that just because someone sits on this committee doesn't mean they necessarily understand the complexities of financial services or the needs of the communities they claim to represent. His eyes fixed directly on Crockett as he continued. Some members, and I won't name names, seem to have gotten their positions through diversity initiatives rather than merit, and their questions reflect a fundamental misunderstanding of how banking actually works in America. The room fell completely silent. Even the usual background noise of staff shuffling papers and typing notes ceased. Crockett's expression remained perfectly composed, but those who knew her well could see the subtle tightening around her eyes that signaled she was shifting into what her former law firm colleagues had called litigation mode. Donalds, apparently not recognizing the danger he was walking into, continued his attack. I think it's problematic when members use their time to advance racial grievance narratives instead of focusing on actual policy solutions that could help all Americans access financial services. The gentle lady's questions seemed designed more to score political points than to understand the real challenges facing community banks. Republican members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. While they were used to partisan attacks, Donald's comments had crossed a line into personal territory that violated the usual norms of congressional courtesy. Several Democrats looked stunned, while others appeared angry. But all eyes eventually turned to Crockett, waiting to see how she would respond to what was clearly a racially charged attack on her qualifications and motives. When Crockett finally spoke, her voice was calm, almost conversational, but it carried an undertone that veteran congressional observers would later describe as dangerously controlled. I thank the gentleman from Florida for his interesting perspective, she began, opening the folder that lay beside her microphone. And since he's raised questions about qualifications and merit, I think this might be an appropriate time to examine some records. Donald's confident smirk flickered slightly. He'd expected anger, defensiveness, perhaps an emotional outburst that would reinforce his narrative about her unfitness for the position. He hadn't expected this cool, methodical response. Madam Chairwoman, Crockett continued, I'd like to use the remainder of my time to address the gentleman's concerns about qualifications, since he seems so interested in this topic. Mr. Donalds, you mentioned merit as the proper basis for committee assignments. I assume you believe your own assignment to this committee was based purely on merit. Absolutely, Donalds replied, his confidence returning. I spent years in the private sector before coming to Congress, working in finance and understanding how markets actually function. Unlike some members, I didn't need on-the-job training to understand these issues. That's fascinating, Crockett nodded, pulling out the first document from her folder. Because I have here your voting record from the 117th Congress, your first term. And it's quite revealing when we look at how someone with your claimed expertise in financial services has actually voted on banking issues. The document she held up was thick. Clearly not something hastily assembled, but a comprehensive analysis that had taken significant time and research to compile. Donald's expression began to change as he realized this wasn't going to be the easy dismissal he'd anticipated. Let's start with H.R. 1595, the Safe Banking Act, Crockett continued, her voice taking on the precise, methodical tone she'd used during her most devastating cross-examinations as a civil rights attorney. This bill would have allowed banks to provide services to legal cannabis businesses, eliminating a significant barrier to financial inclusion for an industry that employs hundreds of thousands of Americans, including many in communities of color that have been disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs. She looked directly at Donalds. You voted against it. Can you explain how someone concerned about expanding access to banking services would oppose legislation that would bring billions of dollars in legitimate business into the regulated banking system? Donalds opened his mouth to respond, but Crockett was just getting started. Actually, let me continue, because the pattern becomes quite clear when we look at multiple votes, she said, flipping to another page in her analysis. H.R. 2543, the Homeownership Opportunities and Mortgage Equity Act. This bill would have expanded FHA lending in underserved communities and created new down payment assistance programs for first-time homebuyers. You voted against it. H.R. 1177, the Fair Debt Collection Practices for Service Members Act, which would have extended debt collection protections to military families. You voted against it. H.R. 1196, the Credit Access and Inclusion Act, which would have helped consumers build credit history by reporting rental and utility payments, particularly beneficial for communities that have been excluded from traditional banking. You voted against it. With each vote she recited, Donalds sank lower in his chair. The confidence he displayed just minutes earlier was evaporating as Crockett systematically dismantled his credibility. But here's where it gets really interesting, Crockett continued, her voice now carrying unmistakable authority. Let's talk about the Community Reinvestment Act. You've spoken publicly about the importance of community banking and serving underserved populations. Yet when H.R. 2543 came up for a vote, a bill that would have strengthened CRA requirements and increased lending in minority communities, you not only voted against it, you co-sponsored an amendment to weaken existing CRA protections. The room was so quiet that the hum of the air conditioning seemed deafening. Republican members stared at their papers, clearly uncomfortable with how this confrontation was unfolding. Democratic members watched with fascination as Crockett methodically destroyed Donalds' carefully cultivated image as a principled conservative concerned about minority economic empowerment. Now, let's contrast this with your voting record on issues that benefit wealthy Americans and large corporations, Crockett continued, pulling out another section of her analysis. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which provided massive benefits to the wealthy while offering minimal relief to working families. You supported it enthusiastically. H.R. 1661, which would have eliminated the Volcker Rule and allowed banks to resume proprietary trading with taxpayer-insured deposits. You co-sponsored it. S. 2155, the Economic Growth, Regulatory Relief and Consumer Protection Act, which rolled back Dodd-Frank protections and made it easier for large banks to engage in risky speculation. You voted for it. Donalds finally found his voice, though it lacked its earlier confidence. Congresswoman, you're taking these votes out of context. These are complex pieces of legislation with multiple provisions. Oh, I'm just getting started with the context, Crockett interrupted smoothly, because I think the American people deserve to understand the full context of your record. Let's talk about your statements versus your votes. She pulled out what appeared to be a collection of press releases and media appearances. On March 15, 2023, you appeared on Fox Business and said, and I quote, "We need to make sure that every American, regardless of their background, has access to the financial services they need to build wealth and achieve the American dream." Beautiful sentiment, Crockett continued. Now let's see how you voted when given the opportunity to make that rhetoric reality. H.R. 3843, the Affordable Banking Act, which would have required banks to offer low-cost checking accounts with no minimum balance requirements. This directly addresses one of the primary barriers to banking access in low-income communities. You voted against it. H.R. 1506, the Stop Wall Street Looting Act, which would have regulated private equity firms and prevented them from loading up companies with debt while extracting massive fees, often destroying good-paying jobs in the process. You voted against it. H.R. 2930, the Protecting Consumers' Access to Credit Act, which would have capped predatory lending interest rates at 36%. the same rate cap that applies to loans to active duty military members. You voted against it. By this point, Donalds looked visibly shaken. The systematic destruction of his voting record was bad enough, but Crockett's delivery, calm, factual, devastating, made it impossible for him to dismiss her criticisms as partisan attacks. But here's what really exposes your hypocrisy, Crockett said, her voice hardening slightly. Let's talk about your own path to Congress and see who really benefited from diversity initiatives. She pulled out another document, and Donalds visibly flinched. In 2020, when you first ran for Congress, you received $2.3 million in campaign contributions from corporate PACs, more than any other freshman Republican candidate that cycle. The National Association of Realtors gave you $15,000. The American Bankers Association gave you $12,000. The Securities Industry and Financial Markets Association gave you $18,000. These organizations don't give money based on merit, Mr. Donalds. They give money based on expected returns on their investment. They looked at a black Republican candidate and saw an opportunity to have someone who could provide cover for policies that hurt minority communities while giving them demographic credibility. The accusation hung in the air like a thunderclap. Crockett had essentially accused Donalds of being the ultimate diversity hire, selected not for his qualifications, but because his race gave political cover to interests that wanted to roll back civil rights protections. That's completely inappropriate, Donalds stammered, but his protest lacked conviction. Is it? Crockett asked. Because let's look at what happened after you received all that corporate money. In your first term, you voted against every single piece of legislation that would have expanded banking access, reduced predatory lending, or strengthened consumer protections. You voted for every bill that benefited large financial institutions at the expense of working families. She leaned forward, her voice taking on the prosecutorial tone that had made her legendary in Texas courtrooms. You took corporate money and then voted exactly how they wanted you to vote, even when those votes directly contradicted your public statements about helping minority communities. If that's not being a diversity hire, being selected specifically because your demographic profile provides cover for harmful policies, then I don't know what is. The silence that followed was suffocating. Donald sat frozen, clearly understanding that he had walked into a trap of his own making. His attack on Crockett's qualifications had opened the door to a forensic examination of his own record that exposed him as a hypocrite and, worse, as someone who had sold out his own community for corporate interests. But Crockett wasn't finished. Since you seem so concerned about merit and qualifications, let me share some of my own credentials that you apparently didn't bother to research before launching your attack, she said, her voice now carrying unmistakable authority. Harvard Law School, cum laude, editor of the Harvard Law Review. Following graduation, I clerked for Judge Barbara Jordan on the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, the same court that decided many of the landmark civil rights cases that made it possible for people who look like us to serve in Congress. After my clerkship, I spent 8 years as a civil rights attorney, representing clients in financial discrimination cases. I successfully sued 3 major banks for redlining practices. I recovered over $50 million in damages for families who were victims of predatory lending. I helped draft state legislation that strengthened consumer protections and expanded access to affordable housing. I didn't get my position through a diversity initiative, Mr. Donalds. I earned it through decades of fighting for the communities that elected me to represent their interests. And unlike some members of this committee, my voting record actually reflects the values I campaigned on. She gestured to the thick folder of documents beside her. Everything I've shared today is public record. Your votes, your statements, your campaign contributions. It's all available to anyone who takes the time to do the research. The only question is why someone would attack a colleague's qualifications without bothering to examine whether their own record could withstand the same scrutiny. Donalds made one last attempt to salvage the situation. "Congresswoman, I think you're mischaracterizing my positions. I believe in free market solutions that help all Americans dash." "Free market solutions," Crockett repeated, flipping to another page in her folder. "Let's talk about free market solutions. Do you remember your vote on H.R. 1500, the Consumer Right to Financial Privacy Act?" Donald's face went pale. He clearly remembered the vote, and more importantly, he remembered the circumstances around it. This bill would have prevented banks from selling customers' personal financial data without explicit consent. A pretty basic consumer protection that most people would consider fundamental to free market principles. The right to control your own information. You voted against it. And then, 3 weeks later, you received a $25,000 contribution from the Data and Marketing Association. Quite a coincidence. The implication was clear and devastating. Crockett was suggesting that Donalds had voted against consumer protections in exchange for campaign contributions. A pattern of corruption that went beyond mere ideological differences. Or how about H.R. 2689, the Stop Overdraft Profiteering Act? She continued relentlessly. This bill would have limited the predatory overdraft fees that disproportionately impact low-income families. Banks make billions of dollars each year charging people $35 fees for transactions that cost them pennies to process. You voted against it. And according to your campaign finance reports, you received contributions from J.P. Morgan Chase, Bank of America, and Wells Fargo totaling $47,000 in the month following that vote. By this point, several Republican members were looking actively uncomfortable. The systematic destruction of Donald's credibility was bad enough, but Crockett's implication of potential corruption was creating a political crisis that extended far beyond one member's reputation. "Madam Chairwoman," interrupted Ranking Member Patrick McHenry, clearly trying to rescue his colleague, "I think we should return to questioning our witnesses rather than engaging in personal attacks between members." But Crockett was ready for the intervention. "Mr. Ranking Member, I appreciate your concern for decorum, but the gentleman from Florida raised questions about qualifications and merit that I believe deserve a thorough response. Since he seems to believe that some members receive their positions through diversity initiatives rather than merit, I think it's only fair to examine what the evidence actually shows." She turned back to Donalds, who looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair. "Mr. Donalds, you've built your political brand on being an authentic conservative voice from the black community. You've criticized other black politicians for what you call plantation politics and claim to represent a new generation of black leadership that prioritizes economic empowerment over victim mentality. But your voting record tells a different story. It shows a politician who takes money from corporate interests and then votes exactly how they want him to vote, even when those votes directly harm the communities he claims to represent." She pulled out one final document. This one appeared to be a detailed statistical analysis. "I had my staff do a comprehensive analysis of your voting record compared to other members who represent similar districts. What we found was remarkable. On issues affecting minority economic empowerment, you vote with the interests of your corporate donors 97% of the time, and with the interests of your constituents 23% of the time. That's not conservative principles, Mr. Donalds. That's corruption." The number hit like a physical blow. 97% alignment with corporate donors, 23% with constituents. Even allowing for partisan interpretation of the data, the gap was so enormous that it suggested a fundamental betrayal of representative democracy. "You want to talk about diversity hires?" Crockett continued, her voice now carrying undisguised contempt. "You were hired by corporate interests to provide demographic cover for policies that harm minority communities. You were selected specifically because your race would make it harder for people to criticize anti-minority policies. I represent my constituents' actual interests, as evidenced by my voting record. my legislative initiatives, and my work outside of Congress. You represent the interests of whoever writes the biggest checks, regardless of how those policies affect the people who elected you. So before you question anyone else's qualifications or suggest they receive their position through diversity initiatives, I suggest you take a long, hard look in the mirror. Because if there's anyone in this room who got their position for reasons other than merit, it's not me. The silence that followed was absolute. Donald sat slumped in his chair, his earlier confidence completely shattered. The systematic destruction of his credibility had been so thorough, so well documented, and so devastating that there was simply no response that could salvage his position. Chairwoman Waters, recognizing that the hearing had veered far from its original purpose, but understanding the historical significance of what had just occurred, made a decision that would be analyzed by political scientists for years to come. I think, she said slowly, that this exchange demonstrates the importance of preparation, research, and integrity in our work as representatives of the American people. The gentle lady from Texas has provided a masterclass in how members should approach their responsibilities to both understand the issues and remain accountable to their constituents. She turned to Donalds, her voice carrying decades of experience in congressional warfare. And I think the gentleman from Florida has learned that attacking a colleague's qualifications without examining your own record is a dangerous game that rarely ends well. The hearing continued for another hour, but everyone in the room understood that the real business had already been concluded. Jasmine Crockett had not only defended herself against a racist attack, but had systematically destroyed the credibility of one of the Republican Party's rising stars. More importantly, she had demonstrated that the new generation of Democratic leaders would not tolerate racist attacks and had the research skills, legal training, and moral authority to fight back effectively. In the days following what became known as the Donalds Takedown, political analysts struggled to remember a more complete destruction of a member's reputation in a single committee hearing. Conservative media, which had previously celebrated Donalds as an authentic black conservative voice, largely abandoned him. Liberal media praised Crockett's methodical approach and comprehensive preparation. But perhaps most significantly, other members of Congress, both Democrats and Republicans, took note that attacking Jasmine Crockett was a dangerous proposition that required exceptional preparation and unassailable credentials. The immediate political fallout was swift and brutal for Donalds. Within a week, 3 major corporate donors had quietly requested the return of their contributions. 2 conservative think tanks rescinded speaking invitations. And most damaging of all, a group of black clergy from his own district issued a statement questioning whether he truly represented their interests. But the longer-term impact was even more significant. Crockett's methodical demolition of Donalds established a new standard for political accountability. Her demonstration that comprehensive research and factual precision could effectively counter racist attacks provided a template for other members of color who faced similar challenges. The exchange also highlighted the importance of authentic representation versus performative diversity. Crockett's voting record, legislative initiatives, and pre-congressional career demonstrated a consistent commitment to the communities she represented. Donald's record, as she had systematically documented, showed a pattern of voting against those communities' interests while providing demographic cover for harmful policies. 3 months after the hearing, Donalds announced that he would not seek re-election, citing a desire to spend more time with family and pursue opportunities in the private sector. Political insiders understood that his political career had been effectively ended by 12 minutes of devastating questioning from a colleague he had foolishly underestimated. For Crockett, the confrontation established her as one of the Democratic Party's most formidable voices on financial services and civil rights issues. Her methodical approach, legal precision, and moral authority made her a frequent choice for high-profile hearings and media appearances. More importantly, her demonstrated ability to hold colleagues accountable while maintaining professional decorum elevated the standard of congressional discourse. The Donalds Takedown became required viewing in law schools, political science programs, and congressional training sessions. It demonstrated how thorough preparation, factual accuracy, and moral clarity could overcome institutional advantages and political positioning. It showed that in an era of political polarization and racial division, truth and competence still mattered. But perhaps the most important lesson was simpler. Don't attack someone's qualifications unless you're absolutely certain your own record can withstand the same scrutiny. Byron Donalds had learned that lesson the hard way, in front of a national television audience, in a way that would follow him for the rest of his political life. As Crockett gathered her documents at the end of that historic hearing, she reflected on what had just occurred. She hadn't planned to destroy a colleague's career that morning. She had simply prepared thoroughly for a routine committee hearing and defended herself when attacked. But in doing so, she had demonstrated something important about the new generation of political leadership. They would not accept racist attacks quietly. They would not be intimidated by seniority or institutional position, and they had the skills and preparation necessary to hold anyone accountable. The era of unchallenged political privilege was over. In its place was a new standard of accountability, research, and authentic representation. And Jasmine Crockett, armed with nothing more than the truth and the preparation to present it effectively, had shown exactly how that transformation would occur. Years later, political historians would mark the Donalds confrontation as a pivotal moment in the evolution of congressional accountability. It demonstrated that institutional advantages, seniority, party position, media relationships, could be overcome by superior preparation and moral authority. It showed that racist attacks could be turned into devastating counterattacks when the target was ready with facts and the courage to use them. But on that October morning in 2024, it was simply a Harvard Law graduate doing what she had always done: her homework. The difference was that this time, the entire country was watching, and the lessons learned would reshape American political discourse for a generation. The final image from that day: Byron Donalds slumped in his chair while Jasmine Crockett calmly organized her documents, became iconic. It captured not just the end of one political career, but the beginning of a new era of accountability in American politics. An era where preparation trumped privilege, where facts mattered more than fundraising, and where authentic representation would always defeat performative politics. In the weeks that followed, as the full impact of the confrontation became clear, Crockett received hundreds of messages from constituents, colleagues, and political observers. But one message stood out, from a young black law student who wrote, "Thank you for showing us that we don't have to accept disrespect quietly. Thank you for proving that preparation and principle can overcome any attack. And thank you for demonstrating what authentic leadership looks like." That message captured the lasting significance of those 12 minutes in a congressional hearing room. It wasn't just about one member's political destruction or another's rise to prominence. It was about the fundamental principle that in American democracy, truth and preparation could still triumph over privilege and prejudice. And Jasmine Crockett, armed with nothing more than Byron Donalds' own voting record and the skills to present it effectively, had proven that principle in the most public way possible. The silence that had followed Donalds' racist attack became the sound of American political discourse evolving. And when the silence broke, it was broken by the voice of accountability, preparation, and authentic representation. It was the sound of democracy working exactly as it was designed to work.